Well, welcome everyone to this episode of Inside the Outhaus, and it's great to have everyone in the room for this conversation, which I'm particularly interested in, looking at adventure and the difference between peak adventure and misadventure and who decides. My name's Pete, founder, orator, and telemarketer, and I'll just hand over to Maddie to do the acknowledgement of country, and then we'll get started.
Hey all, my name's Mads, so let's just take a moment. We respect and honour Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders past, present and future. We'd like to acknowledge the stories, traditions and living cultures of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples on this land and commit to building a brighter future together. I'm personally on Wurundjeri land tonight and would like to particularly pay my respects to Wurundjeri elders past, present and emerging. And if you guys would like to find out which country you guys are on tonight, just drop it in the chat.
Thanks very much, Mads. Just before we get started on this conversation about this topic, I'd like to just acknowledge the hard work of the oligarchs, that being David, Henry, Mads and Cherie, who without their tiresome work, this project would not get off the ground and provide the conversation that it does within the wider outdoor sector. So if we could perhaps throw the burning questions up into the chat, that would be really good. And then let's kick the conversation off. I guess what prompted this, just while we're putting the conversations in chat, is I recently have had a couple of experiences where I've been leading groups in the outdoors and people have been, shall we say, out of their comfort zone. On the edge of perhaps having a peak adventure, leaning into misadventure, and I just have been questioning while I was managing those groups in that situation, who is in control, and are the students in control, or are you in control, or is it a combination? And control's perhaps the wrong word, but who is ultimately managing the group and the situations and the emotions and all the other things that you're managing in that situation? I guess it is what prompted the chat. What do other people think? Well, perhaps I'll come back, as I feel like I guess I asked that first question about the control of the facilitator or the instructor or the outdoor leader. Is this person actually are they in control, or are there factors that are going on within that experience that are outside of their control? Like the environment or weather or things like that, like things that we don't have control out, but perhaps are going to impact on a experience just because those people may not have the skills and experience to deal with, shall we say, more difficult weather conditions. Thoughts?
I definitely think. Oh yeah, go ahead. I'll jump in.
No, I was going to say, after a moment of stunned silence, we both talk at the same time, Mads. You go first. Okay, I'll go. Pete, I think that a big control factor, or who's in control, comes down to more than just the physical environment. It comes down to the emotional health and the attitude of the facilitator. And so how the facilitator responds in a situation is their responsibility. They might not be able to control the weather, they might not be able to control the attitude of the people that they're with or the experience or anything, but they should be able to manage their own emotions and their own emotional health or mental health and not escalate the situation.
I definitely agree with all things that Alan said. I think to a point, we've got some hand in parts of the experience, but I think also there are factors like environment, but also one factor that we kind of almost forget to consider that's huge. That's the participants and their contribution to their own experience, which, you know, like you hear stories of like participants like forming, like especially in more like adventure therapy stuff, like working with high needs young people, like forming a coup and like overthrowing a facilitator, or like, you know, finding just like trying to go foraging for things, and you know, then surprising facilitator being like, I ate this, but I don't know what it does, it's fine. That sort of stuff. Like, I think that those things can really impact like whether the group's going through that peak experience or not. Is that like a part of the experience? Because you definitely can't really plan those things as a facilitator, can you?
No, I don't think you can plan them, but I think the role of good facilitator, I would see, is someone who is able within the environment and within that setting to be able to manage those things that are going on. Like a great example, early in my career, I was working with youth at risk, and some young boys stole some Ritalin off another boy and ate it all in one go. And so you can imagine when we were walking down a fairly steep river gorge, how wired these two young men who'd stolen this Ritalin and pretty much eaten all of it were. And I guess I tell that story because I don't think you have any choice but just to manage that situation as best you can with the resources and tools you have at the time.
I'll put my 10 cents in. I think a lot of the bigger picture of, is it peak adventure or is it misadventure, really is underscored by how the program's designed and where the quality points are supporting the program. So provided there's sufficient risk assessment, risk management of the activities, the flow of the program, the sequencing of the students' experience or the young person's experiences coming into the program, all of those play into whether or not you have a potential misadventure or, you know, end up taking the students into an environment, or more likely a situation where it's beyond peak adventure and it's now a misadventure type scenario. I found a lot of that within the freelance market, that you don't have a lot of control over what's going to happen to you in terms of the program outline, because you arrive on the first day and you get an hour's briefing, or if you're lucky, you get an hour's briefing, and away you go with the program. And to some extent, it's up to the facilitator's experience and their skills as a facilitator to ensure that if the program is on the edge of being misadventure, that it's managed well enough with the support of the center, the venue, the school, to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Is the facilitator in control? But returning to my first question, is the facilitator, does that individual have enough tools to be in control of what's going on?
I think a properly trained facilitator and someone who has considerable experience, the answer should be yes. The issue that we face is we have a lot of facilitators that either have a lot of experience but very little training in the theory behind it, or they have a lot of training, academic knowledge, but very little practical. And it's hard to balance both of them in the field safely. And that's maybe where mentorship or shadow working under someone else comes in, or being managed, or being, how can I say, monitored and assessed on a regular basis.
I couldn't agree more, Alan. I think that's very valid. And I think that let's hear, what do other people think about this? Does the facilitator have a level of control about a situation which is perhaps in peak adventure moving towards misadventure, or are there more factors involved than the facilitator? I would suggest there are.
I'd have to agree with that, Pete. I think that regardless of the level of training of the facilitator and assessment of the environment and the group, there's always going to have the possibility of that black swan event, either in your case with the students, you know, scarfing a large amount of something that wasn't quite good for them, or some kind of environmental event that overtakes however much training or skill that we do have in the outdoors. And to be blind to that possibility, I think, is probably, yeah, asking to get the gods of thunder to come down upon you.
Just to follow up with what Greg's saying, don't you think as facilitators or guides that while we may be capable of operating at a peak adventure zone, the clients or the people that we're working with should still be in the adventure or the exploration zone? They shouldn't be at our level. We should not push them up to our level. We should rather move down to their level. And their level of peak experience might be very, very much lower than our level of peak experience. And we need to understand that and be able to compensate for that. And just because I might be able to do a grade 4 rapid on a river, someone for the first time would be nervous on a grade 2. And that might be their peak experience. And as guides, we're not here to say, look how, or facilitators, look how great I am and look what I can do. We are here to say, what can you do and what is your level of competency and how do I work within that?
I've just posted a link to a website that's a model, really simple one-page blog. Should come up pretty quickly for most people, that just talks about the modeling around peak adventure and misadventure in a simple way. But I think probably most folks here have experienced that in some sort of training or technical forum in the past. My view, yeah, definitely. I think as a facilitator, you definitely, if you're operating within your comfort zone, you have the ability to influence the peak adventure experience and to keep the clients who have the implied consent from the parents that what they're going to be doing is maybe edging the peak experience, but won't be going beyond that, because then you're stepping into the realms of are you taking liberties with the implied consent and the in parental locus if they're under 18. So the responsibility to be a prudent adult in the outdoors, using all of your skills but not exceeding your skills. So the classic scenario, do you allow 15-year-old boys to jump off a cliff edge into a lake or into a river if it's not actually explicitly on the program, but it's actually something that they encounter as they're traveling through the area? And it becomes a real interesting question about managing risk as opposed to managing the happiness or the enjoyment of the experience for the participants. The boys will definitely want to jump off the very tall outcropping into the water, but potentially without it being risk assessed on the day and part of the implied program, potentially it's now misadventure, or potentially could be misadventure, not peak experience, and certainly not part of the program. I've had those experiences myself, and it's always hard to be the bad guy, I guess, in that regards, to go, no, you can't do that. But there is a really good lesson to be learned about risk taking for the young men, especially in that sort of demographic, about how do you assess that as a competent outdoor facilitator.
It's a long time since you've seen program designs with cliff jumping as part of the program.
Yeah, that was back in the 90s, Pete, when you could do anything. And that was definitely in another country, so I won't mention where or where I was working, but yeah, it was part of the implied part of the program, but it wasn't something that most parents would have agreed that was a necessary part of the program, but it was the only thing that got talked about after the program.
And I asked David, did people in your group cliff jump?
Yes, they did, yeah, but I done the right thing and had gotten cold and had done the whole diving, and it was a known sight for the organization. But it was, again, yeah, it wasn't so much challenge by choice, it was rite of passage type scenario we were working into there for that young group of young men. So it was interesting.
What, all their fathers and grandfathers had cliff jumped before?
Yeah, it was part of the tradition of that trip or that journey, yeah. Regardless of, yeah, a modern take on risk management and or medical evacuation facilities from that location and or any number of other things that were going on. But again, that was the 90s, so better not say too much. Angus, you've joined us from, I believe, Vietnam. Would you like to just say hello and throw your 10 cents in? Welcome to the Outhaus.
Yeah, sorry guys. Hi, I am an Aussie, been in Vietnam since 2013, last worked in the field in 2012 when I worked for Bindery and OEG in Victoria and private schools in Tassie, doing outdoor stuff, but unfortunately I haven't been in the field since then.
Do you have a take on on the first question today, our first burning question?
Honestly, I didn't hear it and I didn't read the email and I just went, oh, click on the link. I've got to join, quick. Sorry.
I'll put it back in the chat. Here we go.
Thanks.
Basically, we're asking, is the facilitator in control of the delicate balance, or is it more of a game of chance with little control in regards to peak adventure versus misadventure?
Goes from group to group, I would say, depending on the group's dynamics in terms of how much freedom you allow them to have, wouldn't it be?
I thought it was interesting before with your story, David, that it also seemed that not only the participants' view on what they were expecting when they went into that program had an effect on what that peak adventure experience was going to look like for them, of expecting a cliff jump, but perhaps even, like you said, it was a rite of passage. So like having family members and other stakeholders like who have been previously involved with the program also had an influence on then shaping that view for the participants walking into that program. Maybe something we kind of don't think about as much as like, yeah, siblings who have done the same thing a couple of years ago have talked up a certain program and talked up a particular experience. And then like, you know, they mention about that experience, you're like, okay, like how can I like, you know, create something that like kind of reaches to that peak, or like, you know, or is that not, like you said, yours was in the 90s, so it's not really doable anymore in today's risk management world.
I think you're completely correct. It's the historical nature of the cliff jump in this case. It was maybe a 8 to 9 meter fall from an established ledge into deep water, and there'd never been any issues. But I came into the organization as an outsider with, I guess, a lot more risk management and risk aversion training, potentially having an understanding of peak adventure and the adventure wave and all those fantastic models and methodologies we talk about in the theory of going into the outdoors of young people. And I looked at it and I went, wow, this is really out there. If something goes wrong, that's there's a long way for me to get somebody out on a stretcher from this location. If this 15-year-old makes a bad mistake and doesn't jump out far enough to avoid the rocks at this point, or whatever it might have been, I don't remember the details anymore. But yeah, I had a very conservative view of it, but there was definitely the attitude, because it was an historically done activity, that there was implied consent, but I don't think there ever was, not from the parents and potentially maybe even the students I was with, the young people I was with, didn't understand the potential risks factors involved in it. And there was a lot of pressure to actually allow that event to occur because it was considered part of the peak adventure or part of the thing that was talked about after the program. So and I think you can't justify that type of behavior anymore just because we did it back in the old days. And change is evolutionary and change is resistant at camps and at outdoor centers all the time, but it's also always happening. There's always changes to technical stuff around ropes courses or climbing or food service changes regularly about manual handling. Look at all the COVID stuff that we've been dealing with recently, and how that's changed the dynamics of how we serve food, either in the field with transuse or in a center. Stuff always changes, and I think sometimes as an industry where we hark back to the good old days and we want it to be like that, and because that was it was a fun activity and it was a deemed to be fairly safe activity, but when you mitigate it against what could actually happen if their process is poor or the briefing is poor or the safety is poor, it's an interesting reflection back to the industry, I think. But maybe those days are long gone, and we're all very maybe we don't seek as much peak adventure anymore. Maybe that's the next question.
Well,
Can I add something before?
Yeah, go ahead, Alan.
Can I add something before you jump onto the, do we still seek peak adventure or do we need to? I like Prest's adventure paradigm model that we're discussing here, but I actually prefer Csikszentmihalyi's flow model. And I think that's far more relevant to our context in finding the balance between someone being bored and overstimulated, or in that flow zone where they are just in the place where they're pushing themselves, but they're completely engaged at the same time without having the anxiety linked to it. And certainly in this day and age, I think it's a better model to look at rather than are we going for a peak experience or misadventure, even though the two are quite closely linked.
Alan, do you have a website we could point people to or a resource for that? I think I'm aware of the model, but it would just be a lot great.
Okay, let me pull something up and I'll see what I can find. Okay, I'll put it on the chat.
Yeah, I haven't heard of that one, so I'd be super keen to have a look at that.
Oh, Alan, when I first read Michael Csikszentmihalyi's work, it changed my life. I can't believe that I'm full of a room full of people who have never heard of Csikszentmihalyi. A defining father in I think this sort of work. I'm fully in agreement with what you said, Alan.
Yeah. No, very much so. I actually learned about him before I even went into this industry, and it's been that was my groundbreaking moment, I think.
His initial work, Flow, which is just called Flow, was published in 1975, and it's absolutely amazing in terms of a psychological analysis of this concept we're discussing. Yeah. I was going to ask, but just before we left the peak adventure, misadventure discussion, returning to David's example, because I think it's a good one. People who have a preconceived notion of what the adventure is about because they've heard about it through history or through other campers or through the culture that's going on. Do you think that alters the experience for them? And do you think the experience, therefore, for those people, because of that perception, is more or less risky in their mind, perceived risk?
I'll speak to the experience I had. I think it's it definitely created a bigger perceived risk for that particular activity of jumping from a cliff into deep water. But it also made it equally in the young people's minds something that they really wanted to attempt because it was seen as that next step or a part of their journey or part of the rite of passage on this particular program. And yeah, that's from my experience.
Yeah, it's interesting thinking about a lot of the peak expedition trips that certainly OEG ran, 20 years ago. It seemed like there's a large cohort of kids who would go through those schools, and they would be somewhat inspired by by what their sisters and brothers had done and classmates had done before, and it certainly helped to put some expectation in their head so that the Year 9 girls at Corowa could complete a very difficult trip like a trek because they knew it was possible to do.
Do you think though, Greg, that in that regard, so occasionally that would bring candidates to that program, young people who were taking on more than they bargained for, and therefore their experience was lessened as a result? Like, my older sister did it, so there's pressure on me to do it because I'm going through the school and I need to, show that I'm as good or as tough or whatever it might be. Not to pick on that one particular program, but quite a few of us here know that program.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, Dave, and it's one that would require a bit of unpicking, because I'm sure that the stuff that you're describing absolutely happens. So you've got, like in your example, there's that expectation that someone's going to jump off that cliff when they come to that rites of passage program. They might well get to that cliff and go far out. The 9 meters down to the deck is a long way to jump. They might not want to do it, but they feel like they're pressured into it because that's the expectation.
So in that instance, do you think for them it could lead to a misadventure?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I think that's what Dave was implying, and I think that's definitely possible, especially if you've got this expectation, from years past or whatever, that the experience is going to consist of, thing X. When you get to that place and you realize that it's not just potentially the instructor on the ground and your own, grasp of whether that's peak adventure or not, you've also got this weight of experience behind you, sort of pushing you over the lip. Yeah, could be net negative rather than net positive, for sure.
And the other question that comes to mind, at least for me, is how do you manage the people who perhaps get to the edge of the 9-meter jump and go, today it's not for me. So if it's a rites of passage program and then, 80% of the group has jumped and then, whatever's left hasn't, then how as a facilitator do you manage those people?
Yeah, it's interesting in the outdoors, which is, frankly, a bit of an ableist kind of place to be, really, isn't it? Yeah. It's cut off from a lot of people being able to access it because of, the mobility concerns or the cultural concerns or all of those sorts of things.
Let's move to the second question. What about the fact that are the outcomes of this type of adventure-based learning that we seem to promote, at least through lots of our programming, justify these potential misadventures that we may have in this type of environment?
I'll jump in again. I think there's huge learnings you can have from Misadventure that doesn't have a negative outcome. So allowing a group to get slightly lost on a mildly warm afternoon, but you still get into camp by sunset, but they've picked up on the fact they need to work harder at their nav, and they were never actually lost, but maybe in their minds through the facilitation of the experience, it was a bigger issue than it actually was, because the instructor or the lead adventure activity person knew where they were and had done the trip several times. The outcomes there at the debrief could be, I think, very positive for the group. Plus, it would be the stuff that they talk about after the program more than anything else, because we got lost and we did this and we had a big saga and it was radical, and all the things that they might say as young people. Showing my age now. Radical is not a word they're going to use anymore, but stop laughing at me, Mads. But it's one of those things that maybe a little bit of Misadventure facilitated can help you with some good learning outcomes.
Are you suggesting that radical's a 90s cliff jumping word, Dave?
Or David, were you a radical? Was there?
Yeah, back when I was radical and had hair.
Back when, yeah.
Yeah.
I think that there is potential value, but I think you have to be a skilled enough facilitator to manage that and turn it into a valuable experience, valuable learning experience, as opposed to just something that's going to be potentially a bit traumatic on the group. I kind of like, I'm going to talk actually about being a participant on a program. We were just talking about age. And I was on a program, and the group we weren't that great with our navigation, but we kind of let ourselves onto private property and didn't realize, and our facilitator pointed it out, because we stopped and we kind of realized we weren't quite where we were meant to be, and we were discussing things for 45 minutes, and our facilitator pointed out like a few things, that we were on someone's private property and had been for 45 minutes, and that's we actually just hadn't taken note of the house that was just up there. And also had pointed out, it was kind of a misadventure, and our communication was just not good. So they were really skilled in unpacking that. But I think conversely, like, I think that just could have gone on and on and on, and also been like, an experience that like made us feel quite bad as a group, a bunch of 16-year-olds accidentally waltzing on a private property. Yeah, does anybody else have any experiences with that?
Yeah, I guess I'll talk a little bit to the experience I had a couple of weeks ago with a group of students. The planned walk was in a river gorge, and the students had signed up for this particular trip, according to them, because they saw the kilometer amounts on the distance we were walking each day were quite short. But the walk consisted of a steep river gorge, lots of rock hopping with, reasonably heavy overnight backpacks on. And I was just with a group of young people who weren't that group of people. And so it turned into a bit of a experience for those people, in that they were definitely asking the question in their own minds, at least, and at times vocalizing it to me, whether they were actually going to get out of this experience alive. There was lots of talk about people wanting to call helicopters, and can't we just be picked up by a helicopter and airlifted out of here? I guess I tell that story because most of those participants, and not all of them, were definitely in a peak adventure kind of state for most of that trip. And yet I bring it up because I think the learning and the connection between that group of 6 students through that experience was deep and and strong, like I've perhaps never seen it or haven't seen it for a while. And I think the power of the experience was what gave those students that connection to that level.
So Pete, you're basically saying and addressing question 3 there, that students who have experienced the epic are better off in the short term then.
Oh, I think the hopefully they'll be better off in the long term, because I think a lot of research suggests that people, not just students, but people don't have necessarily the processing skills to process an experience like that, which has been very complex for them, close to the end of the experience. So I think it will come over time, but I think I saw some things which just indicated that they were much more connected through that experience than lots of other groups.
I've got a bit of a story I'll share with you guys. So an expedition that I went on a few years ago ended up in a bit of misadventure for myself. I was on a mountain biking expedition. I was one of the leaders and I ended up breaking my collarbone. But out of that, I got to see a lot more of the background logistical things involved in these expeditions, and also a bit more respect for healthcare services. And I've since gone on to become a volunteer ambulance operator. So just to develop my own learning and realizing areas where I could improve on.
Jacob, has it great to see you again, Jacob. It's been a while since you've been back in the Outhaus. What about the epic nature of the experience and seeing the logistics that needed to come in and support you to obviously get out? How has that changed your approach as a facilitator when you're taking groups into that similar area or to a similar peak experience? So what learnings have you learned beyond the fact that you're now more hands-on with it?
Yeah, so at the time I was actually a prac student going out on a school program. So I wasn't a qualified instructor at that stage. So having seen that and then developing programs now in the future, I have a lot more respect of making sure it's all right, making sure that all of the background stuff's there, ready to go in case something does go wrong. And like now, whenever I go out, I carry a PLB or any of my paddles, even anything, making sure that everything is just all over the top, prepared for whatever could go wrong.
I concur with what you say, Jacob. I think that shows much wisdom. I do much the same thing. I have more stuff than you can possibly poke a stick at, but at some stage you tend to use most of it, I would think.
A question, aside from Jacob's 50-kilogram first aid kit. Pete, do you think that the benefits of the peak experience had more to do with the structure of the group that you had compared to the experience itself? In other words, the experience was just a vehicle, but the structure of the group was what actually brought about the strengthening or the damage in some cases. In other words, if it was a strong community and we'd grown together, well bonded, we were able then to accept each other, help each other through that peak experience, or even that borderline misadventure, and then say afterwards, you guys, we've actually, because we are together and we've helped, we are better because of it. If no one was there to support me, we could have been worse off because of it.
It's an interesting question you ask, Alan. I think it's difficult to answer on some levels, and I would sort of suggest that it's probably a combination of both of those things. The students at the end, quite a large percentage, probably more than half, suggested to me that they had undertaken something that at the start, on the first day, they didn't think they had the strength and the resilience to get through it. And when they got through it at the end of day 4, they were quite surprised with their ability. So that's the first comment I'll make. So I think that directly affected it, how they took the experience away, coming from that perspective where they didn't think they were going to make it, and then they did. And I think the realism of the experience is probably the other thing that affected them most. It wasn't in any way a contrived experience. It was an experience where we would get to a point in this river gorge, and we'd have to make a group decision. And as I always said to them, we need to make a decision wherever we go based on the fact that all 7 of us can actually do what is required to get there. So there were several routes that became not options, not because, you know, 1 or 2 people could not have done them, but because all 7 couldn't have done them. And I think that type of deep teamwork you can't really buy. And that's, I guess, the answer to the question.
Which then brings on to the next statement, is that emphasizes the importance of sequencing in our activities and in our programs. That you know, if we'd done it on the first day, it would have been an absolute disaster. But by doing it on the 4th day, the sequencing, building the level of risk or the level of stress or the level of challenge, and growing that community that they're in at the same time, would have been your key strengths. So well done.
Well, and as we all know, it's a real art to, I think, quality programming. I think both in the design, first and foremost, and in the delivery, you know, because you don't want to put a group way out of their comfort zone in the initial stages of their experience, because they'll just end up hating it. And I don't think that's fair on the teacher, instructor, facilitator, or the group.
Yeah, as I've just put in the chat, you know, is the scheduled or planned out epic, you know, climb this mountain and walk this distance to get to that mountain, and then walk back to camp and move camp all in the space of a day, achievable? And yeah, I'm talking about a recent experience, and I pulled the pin on the mountain climb for this particular group because their peak experience wasn't going to be a successful one. They were not going to get to the top of the mountain. They were not going to have a positive experience. So we modified the mountain. We had a small adventure in the mountain, and then we came back, and it was still an epic day. It was still a full, you know, 10-hour day of hiking and moving and logistics and setting up camp and doing all the things. But I was still sitting with my teacher at, you know, 6:30, making dinner, and the kids were doing the same at a reasonable time on a May afternoon, as opposed to doing something that another group had chosen to do, which was to go to the top, and they had to be evacuated away from that takeout point. And so their epic was huge. And I don't know if it was as well received by them as a result. And so sometimes I think you've got to look at the program and look at the outline and go, is it a planned epic, and is it achievable with this group today, how they present, as opposed to the unexpected epic that because of mismanagement or because someone rolls their ankle and suddenly a really easy day becomes an epic day to get from A to B. There's definitely differences there, I think. And you've got to be careful, and a really skilled facilitator, and fairly brave, I think, sometimes to say to your program coordinator or your immediate superior, hey, my group's not going to be able to achieve this today. What are my other options? And here's what I'm thinking. I've always approached those days where I actually come in with a plan. Here's my plan A, here's my plan B, and here's a plan C. Let's see if we can work out what we can do to make it successful for everyone, so that yeah, I'm working within my operational levels, as are the students, as is the teacher for that particular program on that particular day.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very wise. I mean, I think as program managers, we should give the facilitators of our programs the scope and capacity within the, you know, within the context of the program to be able to make those judgment calls and change programming as deemed their fit, because that's ultimately, that's what leads to good outcomes. Driving participants up a mountain into the dark for hours on end, I think doesn't necessarily lead to great outcomes, or can, but so it depends on the group, as someone has pointed out.
Actually, I'm going to again talk from a participant perspective, because I'm at uni at VU doing outdoor leadership. So I get to do the stuff at work and then also experience it from a participant perspective. I think sometimes like the unexpected epic can be peak adventure, like to the max, and like, you know, give you outcomes in our programs you would have never dreamed like possible. I was on a trip up at Bogong, and for me personally, like being from Queensland, I was loving life being in the Alpine region. And then, you know, it snowed one night, and this was in December, and I couldn't believe it. And having to, like, you know, be huddled up in a hut for a day because the weather was that hectic, and it was so cold and rainy and snowy, and other people's tents like were just like soaked or broken. Was definitely unexpected, but like I was in peak adventure mode. And then we got to see an evac actually happen and be demonstrated to us, which was like awesome, because, you know, you don't really get to do that live stuff with a mentor too much. Usually your first one, it's just, oh, you're in charge, good luck. So that was even in itself quite epic.
So for me, the crux of the matter comes down to how we facilitate things. You know, there's a big difference between an adventure guide and a facilitator, and someone who's just guiding for the sake of, okay, I understand risk and I understand the levels of the risk and where people need to be and what they can't do and what they can do. But to actually be able to facilitate that also, and to be able to debrief the experience and apply it to a learning, into a learning capacity, or into a capacity where how we're going to apply it in the future, makes a huge difference to any activity, and certainly brings out the benefit of a peak experience.
So this one's another one of the stories from my current workplace. We've got a leap of faith activity. So I work in an adventure-based facility, for context. And with this leap of faith, they have to climb up and jump off it's only 7 meters, I think. But our main clientele is around the year 5, year 6 age group. And so for them, that's pretty massive. So they're really challenging themselves whenever they try that. And when they get to the bottom, we always try to link it back to their lives. And one that I always talk about is how we're overlooking a valley, and towards the back of the valley, there's a waterfall. So we say, okay, in life, you have to look for the positive things, but sometimes we can't. Sometimes we're stuck. We're looking at the negatives. And for this activity, our negatives are thinking, oh, well, we're really high and we really can't do this, and this isn't for me. But it's being able to look through that to find the positives in life. And so the positives for that one is a cool view, and oh, there's a cool waterfall over there. And then I also talk about the skiers and how when they're going down a ski slope, what are they thinking about? And I ask the kids, oh, do you think they're thinking about the trees? And they say, oh, maybe. I say, well, no, if you're looking at the trees, all they're going to think about is, where are the trees? Am I going to hit a tree? What I tell them is, you have to follow the path. You have to think about, where am I going? And that really puts them into perspective and changes their mind to see that you have to look for things to be able to find the good things. If you're stuck in following the negative things, then you're never going to have a good life. So that relates to our misadventures. So if you look at the misadventure as a negative thing, then you're only going to think about it as a negative thing. But if you can see that and you really did give it your best, then think about that as the positive thing. You've done as much as you possibly can.
Wow. Anybody got anything to add, or are we just going to call it there? That was huge. Thanks for sharing, Jacob.
I think what you said is true, Maddie. Let's call it there. Just like to thank everyone for a fascinating and interesting discussion inside the Outhaus today. Hopefully you can join us again in 2 weeks' time, when we'll no doubt have another conversation about another interesting topic in the outdoor sector. Please, if you have enjoyed yourself inside the Outhaus today, then feel free to invite your friends. And if you have any suggestions for topics or conversations, then please send them to contact@insidetheouthouse.org. Thanks very much, everyone, and we'll see you hopefully in 2 weeks' time.